welcome to Volume 1, Number 2 of Electro Pulp Video Magazine. This is the crotchety old fan, and today I am bringing you a little history on the origin of the pulps and the various sizes that they come in. The early to mid 1800s were a time of experimentation in publishing. The industry was responding to two key elements: the industrialization of printing, which lowered costs, and the increase in literacy, which increased demand. In response to these pressures, many publishers began to produce what later became known as penny dreadfuls in the United Kingdom. These were inexpensively produced pot-boiler stories that sold for a penny. Over in the United States, they responded with what became known as the dime novel. The first magazine to be honored with the title of pulp is a magazine called The Argosy. It was published by a man named Albert Munsey in New York in 1896. A close competitor in both time and focus was another magazine called The Popular Magazine, which was produced by Street and Smith Publications in 1903. Interestingly enough, both magazines began life as boys' magazines. This did not prove to have a deep enough audience, and both quickly morphed into offering a wide variety of genre fictions. Everything from jungle stories to pirate tales, detective stories, romance, fantasy, and even proto-science fiction or scientific romances, as we generally refer to them now. Once these publications had proven the market, and in fact that the market could sustain more than a single publication, the floodgates were opened and the stands began to fill. Several authors who remain quite popular today got their start in these pulp magazines. Among them are H. Rider Haggard, whose story She and later King Solomon's Mines would become very popular. The Popular Magazine published the sequel to She called Aisha, and purportedly inspired by such tales, Edgar Rice Burroughs introduced his Tarzan character in the All Story magazine, which was a companion to and eventually combined with Munsey's Argosy. Here we're looking at Amazing Stories. Amazing Stories Quarterly, a large bed sheet. First issue of Amazing, a large bed sheet. A 30s edition, also bed sheet. 40s pulp, standard pulp size. 70s digest, and that last image was the more modern, slick, newsstand, typical magazine size. Astounding Analog, 40s pulp size, 40s digest size, the 60s large format or bedsheet version, and the more modern digest. Okay, what we've got here is a layout of all the different pulp incarnations over the years. Some modern, some very old, but these are arranged, with one exception, in size relationship. So we've got the large bed sheet with the Wonder Stories Quarterly up in the upper left hand corner, and we slowly go down. There is a Amazing Stories 1990s issue that is the standard dimensions for a slick newsstand magazine. Heavy Metal pretty much replicates that. Standard typical pulp with Planet. The same for the British or UK version with Amazing Science Stories. Stirring Science is another British publication. It's almost the same size, but not quite, as the Amazing Science Stories. Wonder Story Annual, a reprint magazine, a little bit smaller.
Yo!
Science Fiction Yearbook, a little bit smaller, and so on down through the very thick Astoundings from the 1940s, typical 80s Galaxy, typical 50s British digest magazine, one of the new size digests with the fantasy and science fiction, and finally a newspaper size first issue of Aboriginal SF. Now, to give you all some real-world idea of how large some of these publications are, here we have several examples of Bedsheet, the Amazing Stories Quarterly from 1928, next to Bo the Wonder Dog, who is wondering what is the point of this exercise. You can see the magazine is larger than the dog. And next up, Bo, we've got An Unknown World, which was a companion magazine to Unknown, John Campbell's fantasy and weird publication. And slightly smaller, we've got the Amazing Stories. And yes, the bag tastes good, doesn't it, Bo? Just a quarter of an inch smaller than the Quarterly. Another Gernsback publication, back to the large format Bedsheet, Wonder Stories Quarterly. And the famous Saucer and Empire State Building and Short Story Contest for Science Wonder Stories. From the 50s, a reprint mag, over an inch thick. I'll show you that in a second. Wonder Story Annual. Now, look how thick this is. This is a typical digest magazine, a Galaxy in this case, from June 77, and slightly smaller is a British publication, Futuristic Science Stories. And thank you very much for your assistance, Bo. And by way of final comparison, we have the Amazing Stories Quarterly, which comes in at 11.5 inches by 8.5 inches, overlaid with the smallest digest that I have in the collection. Several others are the same size, Futuristic Science Stories, and that is 7 3/8 by 5 1/8. Those are approximate because it was probably measured in metric, being a British publication. So the spaceship and the sleeper bid you farewell.